Every catastrophic failure, every market crash, every military defeat, every collapse of a major institution can be traced back to the same silent trigger, an assumption. Yet almost no one ever says, "I assumed." Instead, they justify the assumption as confidence, experience, or intuition, or they blame other people, luck, and circumstances when everything falls apart. They say, "No one could have seen this coming," or "It made sense at the time," or "We were just unlucky." But underneath those explanations, there is almost always a moment where someone stopped questioning and started assuming. We assume the map is the territory. We assume the trend will continue. We assume that because something has always worked, it will keep working. We assume that what feels true must be true, and that our point of view is a reliable lens rather than a distorted mirror. But assumption is not wisdom. It is the mind's laziest shortcut, an illusion of knowledge, a quiet surrender dressed as certainty. It saves us from the discomfort of doubt, from the effort of thinking, and from the vulnerability of admitting, "I don't know." But what it gives us in comfort, it takes away in accuracy and resilience. Human beings are wired for efficiency, not accuracy. Our brains are brilliant machines, but they run on low-power mode by default. Psychologists call this System 1 thinking, the emotional, automatic, frictionless mode that reaches conclusions before the rational mind even wakes up. It is like an autopilot that is always on, constantly drawing instant conclusions, filling gaps, and connecting dots, even when the dots don't actually belong together. System 1 is fast, convenient, and energy-saving. It helps you slam the brakes when a child runs into the street. It lets you recognize a friend's face from across a crowded room. It lets you read these words without consciously sounding out each letter. Without System 1, everyday life would be exhausting. But the same mechanism that makes you efficient also makes you vulnerable. That convenience comes at the cost of accuracy, truth, and sound judgment. System 1 doesn't care about true. It cares about feels right. It cares about coherence, speed, and emotional comfort. If a story feels smooth, System 1 treats it as reality, even when key facts are missing. This shortcut hides a deeper flaw, intellectual arrogance. The silent belief that what we know is enough, that our experience is sufficient, that our interpretations are obviously correct. It masquerades as intuition. But beneath these feelings lies the refusal to question what we believe. The quiet belief that we don't need to double-check, don't need to look again, don't need to open our conclusions up to challenge. And this refusal is responsible for some of the greatest disasters ever recorded. It shows up as groupthink, where people silence their doubts to maintain harmony and avoid conflict. It shows up as strategic blindness, where leaders fail to see existential threats because those threats challenge their worldview or their business model. It shows up as financial bubbles, where crowds mistake emotion for valuation, momentum for safety, and popularity for proof. It shows up as organizational stagnation, where companies rot from the inside because they cling to old assumptions as if they were sacred. True progress has never come from people with fast answers. It has always come from those with the humility and the courage to challenge the foundational assumptions everyone else accepts as truth. The people we call visionaries are often just the ones who paused where others rushed, who asked questions where others nodded along. If you want clarity, if you want resilience, if you want unshakable decision-making in a world full of noise and false confidence, you must understand the architecture of your own mind. Because the enemy is not the world. The enemy is the unchallenged story you tell yourself about the world. Inside every human being, two systems govern thought, one fast, one slow. One emotional, one analytical, one ancient, one modern. Psychologists call them System 1 and System 2. They are not literal brain regions, but two different modes of thinking that constantly trade control back and forth. Most people spend their entire lives under the illusion that they think clearly. But without understanding these systems, you're not really thinking. You're mostly reacting and then rationalizing. System 1 is the fast brain. It is instinctive and automatic. It slams the brakes before you consciously recognize danger. It completes habits without effort. It fills gaps with stories that feel true simply because they are familiar or emotionally satisfying. When you make a snap judgment about someone's character in the first 3 seconds of meeting them, that's System 1. When you assume a person is competent because they speak confidently, that's System 1. When a headline confirms what you already believe and you share it without checking, that's System 1 too. When System 1 meets uncertainty, it reacts with instant narrative. He must be upset at me. The market is crashing, sell now. This sounds true because it matches what I already believe. My gut is telling me the answer. It hates blank spaces, so it fills them with whatever is easiest. System 1 isn't trying to mislead you. It's trying to protect you from confusion, from cognitive strain, from the uncomfortable feeling of not knowing. But sometimes its protection becomes your prison. Because once a story feels true, we stop looking for what is actually true. System 1 thrives on assumptions. It creates certainty long before truth is established. System 2 is the slow brain. Rational, deliberate, analytical. You access System 2 when you calculate interest rates, analyze a business plan, study the side effects of a medication, or break down a complex problem step by step. System 2 is what you imagine you're using all the time, but in reality you only fully engage it in small bursts. System 2 is capable of accuracy and depth. It can hold conflicting ideas in the mind and compare them. It can weigh probabilities, consider evidence, and delay judgment. But it is slow and energy intensive, so most people avoid it unless they are forced by circumstances, by accountability, or by deliberate habit. The tragedy of human decision-making is this: we often use System 1, the emotional brain, for decisions that desperately require System 2, the analytical brain. In investing, System 1 shouts, "Buy now! You're missing out! Everyone else is making money!" System 2 whispers, "What do the fundamentals say? What is the cash flow, the valuation, the risk profile, the time horizon?" In politics, System 1 says, "I like this person. They sound strong. They speak like me." System 2 says, "What does their record show? What are the second-order effects of their policies? Who benefits and who pays the price?" In relationships, System 1 says, "I know their intentions. I know why they did that." System 2 asks, "Do I really know, or am I projecting my fears and past experiences onto them?" In leadership, System 1 says, "We succeeded before, we will succeed again. We are the best in the industry." System 2 asks, "What changed since last time? What new threats exist? Which of our beliefs about the market might be outdated?" The real danger is never raw ignorance. You can fix ignorance with learning. The real danger is the illusion of knowledge, when you think you know, but you don't. When your assumptions have never truly been tested. To overcome this illusion, we need a method: Socratic doubt. Socrates believed that wisdom begins with admitting ignorance, not to appear humble, but to uncover clarity. He would ask question after question, stripping away layers of assumption until the other person either found a solid foundation or realized they had none. Socratic doubt forces the mind out of autopilot. It drags hidden assumptions into the light. Step 1. Identify the assumption. Most of the time, we hold our assumptions like background wallpaper. We don't even see them. Socratic doubt asks you to name them. I assume my job is secure. I assume this friendship will last. I assume this business model will keep working. Make the invisible visible. State precisely what belief you're resting on. Step 2. Challenge the foundation. Ask uncomfortable questions. Under what conditions would this fail? What evidence contradicts my belief? What am I not seeing because I don't want to see it? What would a very smart critic say about this plan? Step 3. Recognize ignorance. If you cannot defend your assumption against scrutiny, you don't know it. You're assuming it. That doesn't mean you must abandon the plan, but it means you must treat that belief as fragile, not sacred. Richard Feynman warned, "You must not fool yourself, and you are the easiest person to fool." Socratic doubt is how you stop being your brain's victim. Human progress, when you look closely, is the story of assumptions being shattered. In the 1840s, physician Ignaz Semmelweis observed that doctors who moved directly from performing autopsies to delivering babies without washing their hands were causing shockingly high rates of death from puerperal fever. His simple solution, wash your hands, reduced mortality from around 20% to under 1%. But he was ridiculed because his conclusion challenged the prestige and assumptions of elite doctors who could not imagine that they themselves were the problem. Later in the 1860s, Joseph Lister challenged another deeply held assumption, that infection after surgery was simply bad luck. He introduced antiseptic techniques and carbolic acid sterilization. Mortality rates plummeted. Today, hand washing and sterilization are obvious. At the time, they were acts of intellectual rebellion against deeply rooted medical assumptions. In engineering, the collapse of the Tacoma Narrows Bridge in Washington state in 1940 was not caused by a lack of intelligence, but by mistaken assumptions about wind behavior and structural resonance. Designers assumed their models were sufficient. They were not. The bridge twisted itself apart in the wind, an expensive reminder that nature does not care about human confidence or engineering pride. In space exploration, NASA's Challenger disaster in 1986 is another tragic example of assumption overruling evidence. Engineers warned repeatedly about O-ring failure in cold temperatures, but management assumed the risk was acceptable and that previous flights had proven the system safe. That assumption turned to fire in the sky. 7 astronauts died because critical warnings were filtered through schedule pressure and misplaced confidence. In warfare, assumptions repeatedly shape history. The Battle of Cannae was a catastrophic defeat for the Roman Republic at the hands of the Carthaginian general Hannibal in 216 BC during the Second Punic War. The Romans assumed that raw numerical superiority guaranteed victory. Hannibal, though outnumbered, used a brilliant double envelopment tactic to encircle and annihilate a much larger Roman army. It is considered one of the worst defeats in Roman history and one of the clearest demonstrations of practical intelligence and strategic mastery ever recorded. Centuries later, France built the Maginot Line, a vast system of fortifications constructed from the late 1920s to the late 1930s, based on the assumption that the next war would resemble the last. The fortifications were designed as a response to the horrific casualties of World War I, meant to deter German aggression by creating an impenetrable barrier. But Germany simply went around it with blitzkrieg, fast mechanized warfare that rendered the entire defensive system nearly irrelevant. And during the Second World War, at Pearl Harbor in 1941, Japanese planners assumed the United States would be too shocked, too fractured, and too demoralized to respond decisively. Instead, America mobilized with historic force. That miscalculation reshaped global history and ultimately contributed to Japan's defeat. In finance, the 2008 housing crisis was built on one poisonous premise: housing prices never fall nationwide. Banks, rating agencies, and investors structured trillions of dollars of risk on this belief. That assumption wasn't written in the laws of physics. It was just a story that had been true for a while. When reality broke that assumption, it broke the global economy along with it. In politics, people assume popular ideas must be correct, that charismatic speakers must be wise, that crowds must be right. We confuse many people believe this with this is true. The human tendency to outsource thinking to the group fuels extremism, division, and policies built on emotion rather than evidence. Assumptions are seductive because they require no mental effort, but they are dangerous because they exempt us from responsibility. They let us say, "It made sense at the time," instead of, "I didn't think deeply enough, I didn't check." But not all assumption stories are tragedies. Some are extraordinary breakthroughs. Some of the greatest leaps forward in human history came from people who did the opposite of what most of us do. They refused to assume. Albert Einstein questioned the assumption that time and space were absolute. Everyone knew Newtonian physics was the complete story. Einstein asked, "What if that's only an approximation?" By shattering that assumption, He gave us relativity and changed physics forever. The Wright brothers did not assume that the big funded experts knew what they were doing. While others focused on making engines more powerful, they questioned the assumption that power was the main problem. They concluded that control and stability mattered more. By building their own wind tunnel and testing relentlessly, they broke the assumption that only governments and large institutions could solve the problem of flight. Netflix questioned the assumption that people wanted to drive to a store to rent movies. Then they questioned the assumption that people needed physical discs at all. Blockbuster assumed that their business model was untouchable. Today, Netflix is a global streaming giant. Blockbuster is a cautionary tale. SpaceX questioned the assumption that rockets had to be expendable. The space industry had spent decades accepting this as a fact of life. SpaceX asked, what if rockets could land and fly again? That single broken assumption is reshaping space economics. On a smaller scale, entrepreneurs, scientists, artists, and everyday individuals make breakthroughs each time they ask, what am I taking for granted here? What if the opposite is true? So the question becomes, how do you live like that? How do you become the kind of person who doesn't just drift along with assumptions, but actively tests and reshapes them? This brings us to the JPIW framework, the blueprint for protective wisdom. Step 1. Stop the outcome assumption. Outcome assumptions distort perception. When you assume success, you ignore risk, you overestimate your skill, and you underestimate randomness. When you assume failure, you ignore opportunity, you self-sabotage, and you stop before you start. The moment you lock onto a specific outcome, your mind starts filtering reality to match it. Instead, shift your focus from predicting outcomes to improving processes. Ask, what is the best process I can follow given what I know now? What information do I still need? Let outcomes emerge from rigor, not from wishful thinking or fear. Step 2. Clear your mind with Socratic doubt. Ask yourself, what must be true for this plan to succeed? And what belief, if wrong, would completely break this strategy? Most failures come from one untested belief at the core.
Identify it.
Write it down. Treat it as a hypothesis, not a fact. Step 3. Conduct a pre-mortem and real due diligence. Imagine your plan has already failed. You are 6 months or 3 years in the future, looking back and explaining what went wrong. This simple shift frees you from ego. You are no longer defending your plan, you are investigating its weaknesses. What broke? Which assumption failed? What blind spot came back to bite you? Then go look for those failure points in advance. Talk to people outside your bubble. Study cases where similar plans failed. Look for data that contradicts your happy story. If your idea survives that kind of attack, it becomes much stronger. Step 4. Build contingency, prepare for falsification. Everything breaks eventually. Every plan faces resistance. Every idea gets punched in the face by reality at some point. Contingency is how you make sure that when this happens, you bend instead of shatter. Practically, this means have backup plans. Don't bet everything on one client, one product, one source of income, one social circle, one narrative. Keep emergency savings. Diversify your skills. Have exit strategies. Decide in advance. If X happens, I will do Y. That way, when an assumption breaks, you are not paralyzed. You already know your next move. Step 5. Take the calculated chance with resilience. Once your assumptions have been identified, challenged, tested, and buffered with contingency, you earn the right to move boldly. Confidence is no longer bravado, it is informed. Risk is no longer blind, it is measured. Failure is no longer fatal, it is survivable. This is protective wisdom, not fear. Not endless hesitation, not analysis paralysis. Protective wisdom is prepared clarity. It is the ability to say, I may still be wrong, but if I am, I know how I'll adapt. Alan Alda said, your assumptions are your windows on the world. Scrub them off every once in a while or the light won't come in. That is what this entire framework is about. Cleaning the glass so you see more clearly. Lazy minds assume. Rigorous minds validate. Assumption is the birthplace of disaster. Doubt, disciplined, honest doubt, is the birthplace of wisdom. Progress, both personal and societal, belongs to those who challenge what others accept blindly. Your future, your relationships, your finances, your career, your health, your sense of meaning will be shaped by whether you challenge your assumptions or surrender to them. Most people believe they are thinking, but real thinking takes effort. It requires discomfort. It requires humility. It requires slowing down long enough to ask, what assumption am I trusting? What belief am I standing on? What if it is wrong? And how can I know sooner before the cost becomes unbearable? To make this practical, start small. Today, pick one area of your life, a financial decision, a relationship tension, a career move, a health habit, and write down just one assumption you are making about it. Then ask, how do I know this is true? What evidence would change my mind? Who could I talk to who sees this differently? That simple act turns vague worry or blind confidence into a concrete inquiry. Over time, this becomes a habit. You stop being afraid of being wrong because you catch wrong earlier when it is still cheap. You worry less about appearances and more about accuracy. You become harder to manipulate, harder to mislead, and harder to knock over. You trade fragile certainty for flexible strength. That is the quiet compounding power of challenging assumptions, day after day, decision after decision. Wisdom begins where assumption ends. If this video gave you something valuable, please like, share, and subscribe. Together, we're building a world where wisdom is practical, accessible, and life-changing. See you in the next episode.